Hey guys, my name is Mankin and welcome back to Mastering EDM with Logic Pro. And today I'm going to talk about mastering, and actually it's going to be mostly talking, not a lot of doing in this video, because I kind of got to talk about all the terminology, all the everything that needs to happen so that you can learn, what mastering is. If you already know what mastering is, you just want to go into it, skip over this video for when I get the rest of those out. But this is going to be a little series here on mastering so you can learn everything that you need to know. Okay, so first things first, with everything that we've been doing so far, you know that we have audio and we have volume levels. And so I'm going to play this track back, actually, and I'm going to let you hear or see the volume level that this peaks at. I'm going to set it to loop, and I'm going to let it run for just a minute, and you kind of hear it and hear what it peaks at. Okay, I don't think it's going to get any louder than that. So what we have here is we have a volume level, and I'm going to pull up the notepad here, and we're going to write this down. Negative 1.2 dB, and it's actually written like that, lowercase d, capital B. And that's decibels, I believe, because the guy's name was Bell. Anyway, okay, so what we have here is we have a volume level, and this is basically I could click it and it'll reset it. So this is the clip level, the peak level that it's at, and so right now it's at a negative number. How does that make sense? Well, the way the audio industry measures things is actually it's kind of an interesting way that it's done. So we start out at 0, and anything above 0 is clipping, and anything below 0 is good. So essentially, the highest you ever want to hit with a volume level is 0. So that's kind of like the middle ground. Anything above is bad, but you can let it go over that sometimes, just a little bit, and anything below is good. So that's kind of the way we measure it. If you're not used to that, just kind of think of it. If we started with 0 and went up, you'd never know when you were hitting the bad point. And if we started like with 0 and we went down, then there'd never be and we didn't have an up, there'd never be a point to where you know, where's the end. So that's why we have it. We have below the good spot and above the good spot. And below can be scaled up, but above cannot be scaled down quite as easily. I'll kind of show you why in a minute. But so I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of things in this video. I'm going to start with normalization. And you're gonna see why in a second here. So we have this volume level that we're at, and we can actually pull this up and make it so it's clipping. Hold up. Okay, so you could probably tell there is, first of all, this thing turned red, and it no longer has a negative sign. So now we're hitting positive 4.7 decibels. So that means that you kind of see what's going on here. We have positives and we have negatives. And essentially, what does all this mean to us? And when I turned it up there, despite the fact that we're going over, it doesn't actually sound that bad. That's kind of, that's one of the things about the way Logic works. I'll talk about that in a second, but first I want to show you what happens. Okay. So I've turned this off here just to kind of reset it. And now what we're going to do is we're going to bounce this track down. I'm going to unloop that, just click bounce here. And then we're going to set this to the end of the loop, which is at 5. I have some settings here that are basically what you usually do for like a final bounce for when your track is when you're mastering your track basically, and I'll show you what these do some other time. But for now, it's just set it on this for highest quality stuff for your final output track. That's my suggestion. And then I'm not going to include the audio tail. You might want to do that for some of yours, but I'm going to set this to no normalization. And we're going to go through this 6 different files just so you kind of see what's going on. And then I'm going to, but for now, I'm just going to bounce this one with no normalization. And then I'm going to save it here. Normalization off. Okay. I already bounced out the other two that we're going to do, so I'm going to just show you those. We have it off, overload protection, and on. Just save us time. I already bounced it out on the other two, and then I'm going to drag these into the project, and we're actually going to look at it and see something rather interesting. And here's where I'll explain what normalization does. So we have off, overload protection, and on. Now I'm going to close out of this, grab the 3 files, and drop them into Logic. Create new tracks for each of them. And now we're going to look at them. Okay, so we have 3 tracks. I'm going to bring these over here so you kind of see them differently, or separately rather. And now we're going to look at them. First we're going to look at them, then we're actually going to measure them. Okay, so if you see these two, normalization off and overload protection, kind of look the same. Normalized looks a little bit different though. It looks kind of like it's fatter. It's very hard to tell unless we do it and pull it up right there. So you kind of see now that this one is definitely louder. I'll talk about what this is in just a second, but first we'll play it through and we'll kind of like measure the volume levels of this. So the peak volume level, we'll let it play back. Okay, so that one's at -3 when it peaks. This one will do the same thing. Okay, it's basically at -3. We're just gonna kind of mess it up. Okay, typically when you play it back, it restarts the little meters here, so you kind of see that. Okay, so now I'm gonna go to this one finally, and we're gonna see what this one peaks at. This one is actually gonna be very different. So you notice that the two are basically -2.9, -3, something around there. Pretty darn close. And then we're gonna play this one back, and you're gonna hear something very different. We hit -0.1, which is very, very close to 0. And you'll actually notice that now this text is yellow instead of the color it was before. Green. So, and that one is actually at -3, you kind of see now, since I was playing it back. They're both at -3. I just messed it up the other time when I was playing it back differently. Okay, so these ones are exactly the same, but this one's a lot louder. So that's what normalization does. Normalization actually does 2 things. I'll show you the second thing it does later, but when you have overload protection, you'll notice that's not doing anything really. But normalization, what it does is it takes the highest point, and I'll show you the waveform here so you kind of see, and it brings it up to -0.1. So I'm going to scale this down a little bit, and you'll notice this peak point here is basically squashed up at the very top. And if I actually pull it up in closer, you might be able to see that. If we slide over to figure out where that is, right there. That's the peak point. That's the highest point it goes. And it basically finds that highest point. Sometimes in a different track, it'll be lower. It'll be around here or something. And then it pulls it up. So it's basically just touching the top. You can't see it exactly on this just because it doesn't really show very well. Here, let's see if I could actually line it up. Where'd it go? There we go. It doesn't really show well that it's hitting actually almost the highest point. But you could kind of, that's basically the idea behind it. It's getting the highest point of the track and scaling the entire track up uniformly to that point. So, so what you're actually seeing here is it's not necessarily like taking that point alone and pulling up. It's taking the entire volume of the track and turning it up so that the highest point here doesn't clip. Like we were talking about before, when you pull up the audio, it could turn red and it could clip. So it doesn't sound bad in Logic, but now I'm going to show you what clipping sounds like when you do it and you bounce it. So we're going to go to this part here, go back to the beginning here, and we're going to pull this up to +6, and then we're going to bounce this again 3 times. Okay, I didn't bounce it all the other ones, so it's actually going to be a little bit of a process here, but just deal with it. Okay, so now we're bouncing here. First, we're starting with normalization off. We're gonna, oops, actually, I forgot to check something. Bounce. Yeah, we want the end to be 5. Okay, so normalization off. We're gonna bounce it, and then we're gonna say this normalization off. Clip. Bingo. And then we're gonna drag that one in a second, but for now we'll just bounce this. Set it to overload protection only. I think when I have this looped, it actually can make a little bit of an issue. So we're going to bounce this overload protection only, And then we're going to set the this here to 5 because that's the end of our project. And then we're going to bounce this and normalization off. This one is overload protection clip. And then let's see, final, last but not least, bounce normalization on. And then we got to set this to 5. Now, if the first one has a weird volume level, it's because I had the loop thing on. And for some reason, I was trying to record this earlier, and when I have the loop on, sometimes the normalization goes wacky and it doesn't normalize correctly. So it actually normalized quieter, which doesn't make sense, but it did. So bounce this, finally, normalized, and then we're going to set this to clip. There we go. So now we have 6 tracks. I'm going to pull these in here. Doop, doop, doop. Hopefully this works and I don't have to rebounce the first one. Create new tracks for all of them. Yep. Okay, it worked. Bingo. Okay, so now you'll notice that we have this one, which looks a lot different from these two. It looks like it's a lot louder. All the volume levels are much higher. Actually, if you look at the waveform here, we could go to just zoom it out, and you'll see there's a lot of times where it basically hits that very high point, and it kind of like literally squashes up right against the top entirely. So we're going to listen to this now, and you're going to hear the difference. So just kind of refresh your memory. This is what it sounds like with one of these. Actually, this is what it sounds like when it should be normalized. Whoops, I still have it boosted. There we go. So that's what it should sound like when it's normalized nicely. So now we're going to go bring this loop over here, and we're going to listen to the one that is peaking. Remember when it was in red, and then we just bounced it with no normalization. So we're going to listen to this here. Now, it doesn't sound that bad, but it's actually distorting underneath the hood. So if you kind of listen here, I could kind of show you, emulate what's going on here. But what happened was when I pulled up the volume and let it clip, it started distorting. So I'm going to go use the same thing. We're just going to do this digitally. And we're going to turn off the compression here. Just set the ratio to 1 and the threshold to 0. You don't have to do both of those, but technically. Okay, and then we're going to go to clip with the distortion. And that'll basically emulate like it's peaking. And then we're going to turn up the volume level using a gain plugin. We're going to do it slowly but surely. I think, what do I hit to do that? I think I hit shift. Yeah, I hit shift to do that. Okay. So we're going to pull this up slowly and kind of listen to how it distorts when you pull it up and what it sounds like when you clip it. That's what it sounds like when it's clipping. So what we're doing is we're letting it clip through the compressor actually, so you kind of see it going on here. So you see it peaks at basically 6.7. Actually, it doesn't peak at that, but that was one of the values that hit it. A positive 6.7. So that went really freaking loud. And you can kind of see here that we're clipping insanely. I think that's actually what it's hitting. I'm not quite sure. That might be what it's hitting, 7.2. But we're letting it clip, and that it gets that nasty distortion. That's what happens if your track sounds fine in Logic and you suddenly bounce it and it just sounds nasty and distorted. It's because you don't have normalization on and it's clipping. So that's really bad. We're not going to want that one, but it does kind of look like it's really loud. So and now we're going to go to normalization. Actually, we're not going to go to normalization yet. We're going to go to overload protection. Now, overload protection scales it down from the highest peak. So it's the exact same thing as normalization, except for instead of pulling it up, it scales it down. Now we'll compare the two here. We have overload protection when it was clipping and overload protection when it wasn't clipping. So this is the difference here. This one, overload protection, pulls it down if needed. But if it's low enough, then it doesn't bother pulling it up. That's the difference between overload protection and normalization. Normalization does the same thing regardless of how loud it is. It'll pull it up if it's too quiet, and it'll pull it down if it's too loud. So that's the difference here. So we have these 3 types of normalization, and this is actually kind of explains what's going on. If you have a track in Logic, you bounce it out, you use normalization, or you use overload protection, and then suddenly your track's a lot quieter when you bounce it out. It's probably because you have a cymbal or something that peaks really loud, And essentially what it does is it finds that really loud cymbal and it shrinks down the volume of the rest of the track to compensate. So essentially what happens is your volume is brought down from what you were hearing in Logic because it's trying to make it so it doesn't clip like this. So essentially normalization, both forms of it, overload protection and normalization, is trying to prevent clipping. Whereas this one just kind of renders in the clip. If you have normalization off, it just kind of renders in the clipping and it lets it stay. So you usually don't want to do normalization off. My suggestion, unless you want to get distortion, my suggestion is if you don't want it to be pulled up, just use normalize or overload protection, and then it'll pull the things down if it ends up clipping, but it won't pull it up. Normalization pulls it down or up depending on how loud the track is. I can actually show you here that in this case, normalization and overload protection are the exact same when it's clipping already, but when it's not clipping, overload protection and normalization off are exactly the same. So you kind of see, just if you think through the process here, it's a little bit of, it's easy to get them mixed up in what they do. But I kind of already talked about it a couple times. If you are confused, watch it through again and you'll probably get it the second time through. So there's just these different tools and that's kind of what they do. So now, what is mastering? Mastering is getting everything to non-uniformly squash up to the top. So we have this track here, and say we want to scale up the whole thing, not just these peaks. So almost like what we see here. So you see that not only is there just that one part that's hitting the top, there's the other parts too. So it's like scaling up the whole track, but at the same time, we don't want this nasty distortion that we get when we do this overload or normalization here. So I can hit this one, pull down the master so it doesn't blow your eardrums out again, and I'll just play it back here. We don't want that. We want it to kind of sound like how it was when it's just peaking at 0. So you can kind of see how I said before, it doesn't sound that bad. If you're good at audio, you'll hear that it's clipping in the high end, and you can definitely tell that, and some in the low end too. But otherwise, it's not that bad. If I heard a track that was mastered, quote, like this, I wouldn't actually throw it out the window. But if I heard one that was mastered like this, I just wouldn't listen to it because it sounds nasty. So that's essentially what mastering is just pulling up all the levels throughout the entire track so that it's at a high volume level, but at the same time it doesn't sound distorted and nasty. So that's essentially the gist of mastering. We're just pulling up the level so that everything looks nice and it's loud. So I believe I talked about everything I needed to talk about in this video. I'm going to talk a little bit more about mastering, the types of mastering in a second here, but I wanted to just kind of go over the 3 parts here. We have the different volume levels, the negative ones, the positive ones, and then optimally when it's hitting 0 here. Actually, there we go, that's perfect. Because since it peaks at -3, if I boost it by 3, it hits 0. So that's the optimal point. So that's one of the things I talked about, the volume levels. And the second thing I talked about was the different types of normalization, which are key when you're doing your final master. You'll typically want to normalize it just in case you do a tiny bit of peaking or it's a little fragment underneath 0 decibels. I have fun pronouncing that word. And then the final thing I want to talk about here is mastering and why you need it and kind of the different styles and the thought process behind it. I imagine this is a little bit of a long video already, but this is a very important part here. So mastering, why do we want to scale this up? The reason is because if you've listened to your track on SoundCloud, then you've listened to a professional track, you'll realize that the professional track is a lot louder. So what is the point of all this mastering and trying to get it loud? The reason is because it allows for consistency between different tracks. So when you listen to one track, you listen to another track, you listen to another track, they all sound like they're kind of the same volume level. You'll notice that when you're listening to your music library. You'll be playing back, you'll listen to one song, you'll listen to another song. It doesn't feel like one's a lot louder. You don't have to turn up or turn down your volume between each song. So that's kind of what's going on there. It allows you to have consistency for all your songs. Now, there is some variance. You kind of have to realize that there's always going to be variance because no one can master everything exactly the same as every other track out there. But essentially, everyone's shooting to get the same loudness. Now, that poses a problem. What happens if person A has a much louder track than person B? Person C comes in and he hears both tracks. He's like, naturally, I want to scale it up to be the one that's louder. Then we get what's called the loudness war. Everyone is pulling their tracks up to be as loud as they can without it clipping or distorting. And that causes a problem. Mastering, the whole process involves EQing and mostly compression and a little bit of distortion. So what happens is people start to sacrifice what's called dynamics, which is the punchiness of your track, or the loudest and quietest places. Are the loudest parts louder than the quiet parts, or are they basically the same volume level? And so when you start to compress too much, everything becomes the same level, nothing becomes really punchy, and everything starts to distort a little bit. So essentially you get this war that is causing tracks to kind of, fight for who's the loudest. And that's what the loudness war is, if you've heard of that before. It's about mastering a track to get it louder than the next person's, or as loud as the next person's. And it's very, very difficult to get a good master. I kind of talked about when I was talking about mixing at first. Mixing is an art and a science. So is mastering. And mastering is an art and science in and of itself, because you're usually taking, usually don't have your tracks laid out like this, actually. Someone will give you the entire track like this in one file, and you'll master it. That's would be your job as a mastering engineer. There are mix engineers and mastering engineers, two completely different jobs. Some people specialize in both because they can, but it is actually two completely different jobs because the two arts are completely different in many regards. So with mastering, you're usually stuck with one or two channels. Sometimes they'll give you the track split in two. Sometimes they'll give it to you in one stereo track, and then it's your job to master it. So, I kind of already talked about how we use EQ and compression and then some distortion. I won't talk about all the details of those, but suffice it to say, my whole process of looking through the process of mastering is going to be split up into those three sections. We're going to do some actually, it might be split up into more of that. We'll see. But we're going to talk about EQ and getting the EQ right, final EQ right. And then we're going to talk about compression, the regular compressors and limiters. And then we're also going to talk about some distortion and using harmonic distortion, as well as, what's it called? Enhancements. Come on. The word's slipping me. It's basically adding harmonics to something. So it's a form of distortion that basically allows your track to have more character or sound. It actually sounds nicer sometimes if you do it right. So so that's basically what we're going to cover through the series. But suffice it to say, I keep on saying that. It's kind of annoying when I start saying something over and over and over again, isn't it? Anyway, so we have these different types of tools that we use to get our track to sound loud, but we don't want it to lose its punchiness. We don't want it to lose its emphasis and emotion. Because if you have a track that has a really loud part and a really quiet part, if you have it so it's kind of like bouncing between the two too much, then it kind of sounds like you need to turn up your volume. And if you don't have it bouncing through enough, the quiet part doesn't sound quiet. It just kind of sounds like loud, and it doesn't give the quietness that you need. So then why you would actually bother learning mastering? Well, you never want to be that one guy who, when someone's playing through their music library, they're just like listening to music and suddenly, boom, it's a lot quieter than every other track. And you're like, okay, I need to pull up my volume so I can actually hear this track. And you're like, it's kind of annoying when a track is that quiet. It's so quiet that you actually need to pull up the volume. It's not like impossible to hear. It just becomes a hassle to pull up and down your volume, because when you finish that song, now your volume's boosted, and when you go into the next song that's just like every other professional track out there, suddenly you're blowing your eardrums out because that one's mastered properly. So that's a problem we run into. And then also you don't want to be that person who bounces down a track and it sounds like this distorted one here. Let me turn on the volume so we don't blow our ears out. But we don't want to be that person that sounds like this. Because that's just never fun. Like, when you don't want to listen to a track like that at all. Regardless of pulling up or down volume, it just sounds terrible when you listen to it like that. So you don't want to be over compressed, you don't want to be under compressed, you don't want to be too loud, you don't want to be too quiet. It's a very difficult balance, and I still have not mastered it by far. I am much better at mixing than I am at mastering, but I'll share what I know, and I'll try to help you guys out. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, I imagine you might have questions for this, because I talked about a lot of different things, spent a lot of time here, and I might have laid things out in a kind of confusing manner, but I'm kind of preparing you for when we go down to master. Things will pan out and make a lot more sense when we go into it, but I kind of wanted to talk about all these terms so that you know what I'm doing, and I don't have to explain normalization when I go to bounce a track and I enable normalization. So that way you'll know what that is already, and you'll know why we're actually mastering. And that's the very important thing. Why do you actually master, and how do you stop your tracks from distorting? How do you get your tracks from being so quiet? That's what this whole process is. So essentially, you know, there's a lot of things you'll need to learn. It's a completely different process from mixing, but it's something that you'll need to know how to do so that your tracks can kind of, you know, stand up to all the other tracks out there. Now, usually, just one quick final thing before I wrap this up. Usually, I would actually send in my track to get it mastered by someone else. Not to say I do that, because I don't have the money to do that. It does cost quite a bit of money to get your track mastered by someone who does it well. But at the same time, normally you would do that, but for when you're just getting started, you don't have the money to send your tracks in, and you just kind of have to master them yourself. So it is good to know a little bit of it, and it's also good to know what mastering does and kind of like what it entails. So like, oh, is it going to make my mix sound a lot better? Usually not that much. So really, you kind of got to know your expectations, and why you would also send it to someone is because you want them to listen critically to your track, because sometimes if you've mixed your track to make it perfect, you think, well, my track's already perfect, I don't need to do anything else to it. So, and you've been listening to it so many times, and maybe you just slap a good limiter on there that just kind of brings up the volume level. Well, what a mastering engineer does is he'll listen to it critically, compare it to a lot of other tracks, and figure out how to get it to slot in so that it sounds like a professional track that fits the kind of standards that are set out there. So that's why you'd send it to someone else typically, but at the same time, you know, you can do it yourself. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too confusing, and I hope you learned a lot. There's a lot to cover. You may want to watch through the beginning of the video again if normalization was kind of confusing. Once again, I have these 3 things here. You can kind of check it out and read these if you want to pause it. Let me scale it down just a little bit so you kind of see what these line up to be like. We have the different ones, and they're all named there. If you need to kind of look at them, just to kind of remind yourself what normalization does. So yep. We're avoiding distortion, and we're trying to get things louder. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.